Matt, the international aid budget is really important to church members. The bishops say for any party to abandon the current 0.7% GDP figure or to reduce this commitment would be globally irresponsible. What would the Labour Party do on international aid?
Yeah, well, we've made it very clear. We live in difficult times when difficult decisions have to be made about what we spend our money on. But the Labour Party has been very clear that there are certain budgets which will be protected: health, education and overseas aid. So we're obviously committed to the 0.7 of gross national income to be spent on overseas aid. The Labour Party is very committed to it. It was when it was last in government, for example, cancelling a lot of third world debt, for example. And we believe, that the 0.7% is not only morally right. At the end of the day, when we talk about poverty in this country, it's different to the kind of poverty that many third world countries experience. There are people in the third world. We have 1 billion people on this planet who live on less than £1 a day. And these are people who don't have access to running water, to decent housing, decent food. And therefore, we have a moral responsibility as a wealthy country, we're still the 5th richest country on this planet, to actually help people in other countries. That's a moral duty we have. But also, it makes practical sense because at the end of the day, when you spend money on overseas aid, you are preventing, especially, for example, preventing failed states, because if you have a failed state, then there is the danger that, for example, it might lead to migration, which has an impact on us. It leads to environmental damage, which has an impact on us when it comes to flooding. It can harbour terrorism, for example, which impacts on us. So overseas aid is both morally right, because we have a duty to look after those in poverty, but also it makes practical sense because at the end of the day, it tackles things like environmental damage, terrorism, migration, which has an impact on Britain as well. And I think Britain has a historical, I'm a historian in terms of my academic background, and Britain has an added responsibility because, of course, many of these countries were actually ruled by Western European countries at one point, and their borders and their economies were often, set up in a way which favoured and were to the benefit of Western European countries. And that's some of the reasons why these countries are in poverty, because their economies were done in such a way that they were designed to provide us with raw materials, primary goods, and those are the kind of things that tend to end up very cheap on the world market. So the Labour Party is totally committed, even in difficult times, to a 0.7%, and that is a firm commitment from the Labour Party.
What about the argument that some of the money ends up being misused?
Well, the interesting thing is that when you are dealing with third world countries, you're often dealing with countries which are, some of their political systems, some of their economic systems are not as efficient as they could be. And what the government, what the Labour Party has always said is that they will continuously review how that money is spent. For example, the preference of the Labour Party is that that money be given rather to governments. The money should be given to organisations on the ground, charities, pressure groups actually there on the ground, because that's when the money tends to be spent most efficiently. If we're saying all overseas aid will always be spent and will always go to the people it needs, unfortunately that's not the way the world is. If you go to countries like Somalia, which is a country which is a failed state, central government's broken down, some of that money is going to go astray. That's always going to happen. But at the end of the day, most of that money still goes on helping people. And one of the ways in which overseas aid can be used as well is actually building up civil society and ensuring that the people who live in these countries can hold their politicians accountable, so that the politicians, when they are given overseas aid, they are not wasting it. But, it's a price you pay, but I think it's still worth it, even though some of that money might sometimes go amiss. But we have to continuously assess to make sure it doesn't, and also to make sure it's going to the people who it's going to effectively help the most effectively. Yeah.